Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, an ongoing study in the Theology of the Apostle Paul by Professor James Dunn. We're going to take a look at pages 177 to 187, and we're going to take a look at Paul's conversion. How do we investigate Paul's conversion experience? Because his conversion experience coincided with the first writing of the gospel, the first disclosure of the new covenant gospel. So let's go to block 1 and we'll get started here. Paul's theology can only be understood within the context of the apocalypse of Christ. The gospel preached by Paul was received through an apocalypse, Galatians 1, 11, and 12. The gospel that was preached by me is not after man, neither received of man, and neither taught by man, but by the apocalypse of Jesus Christ. The Apocalypseas Iesu Christou, the apocalypse of Jesus Christ. But Paul also connects his gospel to Abrahamic tradition in Romans 4:11. But the common Christian conviction was that Christ died for us and was raised from the dead. Now, block 1, note 2, Paul saw the gospel as his responsibility to proclaim. The risen Christ had appointed Paul an apostle, 1 Corinthians 9:1 and 15:8, as the apostle to the Gentiles, Romans 11:13, as a gospel attributed to God through Christ. A gospel attributed to God through Christ. And it was a gospel that was affirmed by Jerusalem leadership in the First Ecumenical Council of AD 51. Where Paul says that he went by revelation to Jerusalem. In other words, kata apocalypsin, again, when his gospel message was confirmed and affirmed by the Jerusalem leadership, that also was an apocalyptic moment for Paul. The affirmation of Paul's ministry was also an apocalyptic moment. And then I thought this was interesting that Professor Dunn brought up in block 1, note 3. He talked about the hinge moment of a faith-based new Israel. And this is what Paul became aware of in his conversion. Paul had a radical new understanding of being in the Judaic covenant. And Dunn calls this a hinge moment. Paul's conversion must be seen as a hinge moment where his whole theology is turned around concerning Israel's status and how it was to be reinterpreted in a faith-based way. And we go to Philippians 3:9, which was written AD 60, 4 years after Romans, not having my own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith. A true member of the Judaic covenant, a member of true righteousness, is now all about a faith-based righteousness. A righteousness based on the faith of Christ, his faith, his faithful obedience. That was the primary dramatic apocalyptic shift in Paul's understanding of the gospel, because he did write a theology of righteousness before God, and what he discovered was there is no righteousness by the law. That ended up becoming a wrong, self-affirming belief. But Paul came to the realization that there's none righteous before God, definitely not by the law. There are none righteous. And he had to discover a apocalyptic shift in meaning, and he had to look at the covenant as faith-based covenant. So that was a very dramatic apocalyptic turn of theological meaning for Paul. Let's go to block 2. Paul's conversion took him to a new plane of existence, a new chirological time. Remember, in Greek, there's chronos time, which is chronological time of finite reality. But there's kairos time, which is the time of the realm of spirit. And Paul, through his conversion experience, entered into the realm of spirit and into kairos time, or chirological time. The plane of the eschatological now. Conversion for Paul meant transition to an eschatological plane from one age to another, from one chronological time to chirological time. Galatians 1:4, as a rescue from the present evil age. As a rescue from the present evil age. A rupture with the past and a beginning of new creation. 1 Corinthians 15:8-10. I am the least of the apostles, but by the grace of God, which was bestowed upon me, I labored abundantly because the grace of God was with me. Paul entered unto an eschatological transformation. Then we're taken to Romans 3:21 and 22. Through the righteousness of God and through the faith of Christ, Paul took up a new conversion language, a new faith-based perspective. That's key. He took up a new conversion language and a new faith-based perspective concerning righteousness. That is key to understanding Paul's conversion. So we look at block 2, note 3. There is a sense of apocalyptic disjunction, and yet real continuities were maintained, but in a new faith-based way. With a sense of eschatological newness. Paul would then reread the scriptures from this new perspective. Paul no longer affirmed his Pharisee heritage with enthusiasm. Paul did, in fact, reconstruct his theology through the lens of the revelation of Christ, through the lens of the apocalypse of Christ. All beginning in AD 36, which was the date of the Damascus Road experience, and initially he was very zealous of the tradition, but it pleased God to call me to reveal his Son in me. That's the way that Paul puts it. Apocalypsai, ton, huion, autou, en emoi. God called Paul through the apocalypse of his Son in Paul. In me, he says, within me. Paul declares that the apocalyptic revelatory moment of his conversion was an event of the inner man, the inner-centered self. It was an apocalypse, a revelation that took place en moi, in me, within my inner self, within my inner being, within my centered self. I had a core revelatory conversion experience to the very depth of the core of my inner self. It took place en moi, in me, within me. So make sure that you remember that and keep that in mind. And it's all from Galatians 1:14 through 16. Galatians 1. That's AD 52. That's when Paul was first making sense of his conversion experience. I profited in the Jewish religion, being zealous of the Jewish tradition, but it pleased God to call me, to reveal his Son in me, to reveal his Son en moi, in me, within my inner-centered being. My apocalyptic revelatory conversion took place within my inner core self. My inner core self was completely changed, radically changed through an apocalypse, through an apocalyptic revelatory experience. Let's go on to block 3. Paul's conversion was full self-conscious understanding of the gospel. That's what it was. It was a full self-conscious understanding of the gospel. And we're going to look at AD 56, Romans 1:18 to 3:22, where Paul gives us 11 aspects of the gospel. Now, this was AD 56, 20 years after Damascus Road. The wrath of God is revealed against unrighteousness, for the invisible things from the creation are clearly seen, but humanity glorified him not. They changed his glory into a corrupt image, and his truth for a lie. Therefore, man is without excuse when they come up against the apocalypse of Christ. For there is no longer a privilege for anyone. Even the Jew is now a Jew of the circumcision in the Spirit. Now the righteousness of God has been made manifest in the law and in the prophets and in the faith of Jesus Christ. And in the faith of Jesus Christ. That is key, and we're going to look at that right now in Block 3, Note 2. I'm so glad that Professor Dunn goes here, because to me that's the best Pauline articulation of the gospel, Philippians chapter 2. So let's go to Block 3, Note 2. Now we're in AD 60, 4 years after Romans, 24 years after Damascus Road, and we get Philippians 2, 5 through 9. Christ, being in the very form of God, emptied himself and took the form of a servant, becoming obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Therefore God has exalted him and given him a name above every name. Highlight, circle, draw attention to Block 3, Note 2. Philippians 2, 5 through 9 is the kenosis passage And that is the best description, the best Pauline writing concerning his new theology of righteousness before God. It all is about the faithful, obedient righteousness of Christ. And I'm going to read it again because it's that important. Philippians 2, 5 through 9. Christ, being in the form of God, emptied himself and took the form of a servant, becoming obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Therefore God has exalted him and given him a name above every name. AD 60, 24 years after Damascus Road, Paul was constantly refining the apocalyptic revelatory conversion that he went through for 20 years, for 24 years. When we get to Philippians, it's been 24 years. It's AD 60 when he writes Philippians 2, 5 through 9. It is AD 60. It is 24 years after Damascus Road. After 24 years of struggle and work and relearning and coming to terms with his conversion experience, after 24 years, Paul writes Philippians 2, 5 through 9, which is the greatest articulation of a theology of righteousness before God. There is only a theology of righteousness before God because of the faithful righteousness of Christ as faithfully obedient even unto the cross. And then we close out. Professor Dunn takes us to AD 56, 20 years after Damascus Road, to 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4, 8 aspects of the kerygma. Now, kerygma in Greek is proclaimed gospel, the spoken gospel. And we get the spoken gospel articulated by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 and 4. There are 8 aspects. I delivered unto you that which I received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day, all according to the Scriptures, and was seen by all of the apostles, and seen also by me when I was reborn in due time, after I had been reborn in due time. The kerygma is articulated for us in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 and 4, where Paul writes out 8 aspects of the kerygma. In Greek, kerygma is the proclaimed, spoken gospel. The proclaimed, spoken gospel.